That means implementing creative strategies, but making sure that I'm running the numbers, making sure that I'm thinking about net operating income and how that services debt, making sure that I'm cognizant of cash return on investment and how that formula, that very formula of cash flow divided by initial investment operates. I also want to be cognizant of the 4 ways that I get paid in real estate. Cash flow, appreciation, amortization, depreciation. How do all those relate? And is there a way that I can create this deal in which I pay the partner, perhaps, lender, by way of depreciation or amortization or appreciation rather than from cash flow? Because everyone in here knows, or at least by now, they should know what their number is. How many people know their number? When I say, what's your number? Raise your hands. Okay, the majority of you. So if your number's 20, you know that in your specific market, the cash flow that's being produced from the assets that you're focusing on is $250 per unit. And you need that $250 per unit by way of cash flow. You might say, well, by setting up this deal in which I pay back, notice I very rarely use the word investor. I like to use the word lender, or I like to use the word partner. And you're paying back your lender or your partner. If you pay them back by way of cash flow, you're going to deteriorate that $250. Does everybody see that? So I'm going to say, is there a way that I can pay them back by way of appreciation, depreciation, amortization? Now, we're starting to kind of move up a little bit on the food chain of deal structure. Now, you know, I can tell you, the biggest deal I ever did was $14 million. The smallest deal I ever did was $9,000. Although I am looking at a house when we get home with Heather that is may rival that $9,000 price tag. You thought I was going to say $14 million, didn't you? Heather and I are we're starting to buy houses and renovating them and flipping them, but on the smaller scale. But so I've seen deals from $9,000 to $14 million, and I've instituted all these things. Now I can tell you, on the $14 million side of the world, there's some pretty exotic stuff that you can get into, and we'll save that for another time. As far as creativity, it's what all the big guys do. The Steve Wynn's, the Donald Trumps, all of the people that do these big deals, they implement these high-level components. We're all not there yet. Okay, so let's not worry about that right now. But what we can do is all of the things that I listed here previous, and I want to talk about that specifically. So rules to live by. I think many of us kind of consider the idea, and sorry for the cutoff here, that we've got to look at a total of 20 deals to put offers on 10, to get acceptance of 5, and eventually close on 1. That's not what the real estate game is made of. Really, the real estate game is made of, look at 100 deals, put offers on 10, get 3 accepted, and close 1 eventually. Thank you. And close 1. You can see it's a volume game here. And all the properties that I looked at yesterday with you guys, every property, the first properties I walked all the way through, I walked around the yard, I'm noticing things. I met, you know, we got in those little groups in the driveway and we're talking about what's important, what's not. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, what's the situation of the seller and how to structure this deal? What's interesting about all the deals, I would say the majority of those deals were not listed on the MLS. What's key about that element is the fact that, number one, you're fishing upstream. You see every REO today, every property that's through Home Path or Home Steps, started as a little fish way upstream. And, you know, 2 years prior, the homeowner is saying, having a dinner with their husband, or maybe after dinner when their kids are away, they're saying, honey, I don't know, I'm getting a little concerned because our interest rate just doubled, or our interest rate just tripled. I don't know how we're going to make it. And the husband's like, oh, we'll make it, you know, it'll be fine, it'll be okay. A couple weeks later, I don't mean a doomsday scenario here, but a couple weeks later, maybe a month later, one of the two loses their job. Now they're really at a pressure point. Hey, we've got to list this property. At that point, that's where we should be all fishing. Because by the time it goes through the listing, they're going to list the property for sale. And the realtor is going to really work hard to market that as a quote-unquote traditional sale. The price lowers, the price drops. Why? Because the inventory is high, the demand is small. So they're lowering the price. All of a sudden, they've missed a couple mortgage payments. They get an NOD, notice of default. And then eventually it goes through the cycle of foreclosure, becomes at the foreclosure auction. If it doesn't get sold there, it becomes a bank REO, or it becomes a property that's on home path or home steps. That's kind of the life of an REO. So I don't want you to necessarily fish from the pond of REOs, although that's maybe a good introduction to this world of real estate. I would like you to fish upstream where the opportunity to apply some of these things that I'm talking about today. That's where you're going to implement these. It's very hard for you to implement seller financing on a property you're looking at through home path or home steps. 99.99999% of the time it will not happen. So you instantly have to think differently here. That's with single family houses, up to 4 units. 5 units and over, we're in a new kind of universe. A new world kind of opens up. And it's the world of commercial real estate. Commercial real estate is very much of more of a wild, wild west kind of approach. The rules aren't as stringent. There's a lot more flexibility. There's more creativity. So you'll see as you get up over that 5 mark, and from a dollar amount, if you get up over the $1 million amount for deals, there's a little bit more creativity that can happen. I do believe it's easier to get a deal financed at over $1 million than to get a deal financed at under $100,000 today. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive. That's just the way it is. So I want you to think about that. But this bottom point is you've got to look at a lot of deals, and you've got to be fishing in the right spot. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? So it may be a different approach for many of you. Many of you. So let's talk about some terms and definitions here. An assignment. An assignment is where, and we're going to talk about it in detail, but an assignment is where you are tying up or controlling a property and you assign it to somebody else. Now you might see in that scenario where on real estate contracts you're told to put, you know, John Dessauer and or signs. I don't really necessarily like that so much. I like to have the assignment clause either later in the body of the contract or maybe even on the addendum, because I don't want the seller to see that as the first thing. It's not that I'm trying to hide something from the seller. I just don't want that to be the first thing they look at, red flag. So I like to bury that. We'll talk about all of these things in detail. I just want to give you a generality of what they are. Balloon mortgage. What is a balloon mortgage? Well, I got this question yesterday, matter of fact. A balloon mortgage is where, let's say you set up a deal with a bank or with a seller or somebody giving you a loan. There's going to be a term sheet that you're given. And that term sheet is going to have the interest rate, it's going to have the amortization period, and it's going to have whether it balloons or not. A fully amortized loan would be a loan that acts like it's paid over 25 or 30 years, and that's when the loan It's fully amortized, so it doesn't balloon. It ends after that 30-year, that last payment. A balloon loan may have an amortization of 30 years. In other words, it acts as if the payments, the monthly payments, are stretched out over 30 years, but in 5 years, you're either going to have to refi that loan or pay it off. It balloons, and you've got a decision to make at that point. So that's a balloon loan. Due on sale. Pretty much in every mortgage that you're going to get from a bank, a lender, you name it, there's a clause in there called a due on sale clause. Typically what this clause is it gives the lender the right that if there's a change in ownership, that the bank could call the note immediately due and payable. That's called a due on sale clause. Now, it doesn't say the bank or lender absolutely will, but the lender could or may call that note due. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail. That's one of the things that you want to be aware of as you're structuring all of your creative financing. First right of refusal. This is a language that you would put in a contract that says that you have the first right of refusal if that property is ever for sale. That they give you the first chance or choice at it. Sometimes there's a monetary transaction that is put together with that, other times there's not. But a first right of refusal is a lot of times put in place when you've got a property and you're dealing with a neighbor next door and you make an agreement or arrangement with them that says, hey, if you ever sell, I'd like you to give me, as long as I own this property, the first right of refusal. Okay? Lease option. We're going to be talking about lease options. Lease option is a technique that you all should be using with your single-family houses and maybe your apartment buildings. We all need to think about exit strategies at our purchase. So a lease option gives the tenant the right at an agreed-upon price sometime in the future to buy that property from you. Now you need to be cognizant of what that property should be worth in 3 years, how much of their rent that they're paying may or may not go towards a down payment, but it's a powerful technique, especially being in Canada. It's a way that you can instill home ownership in a renter for your property. Now some states, New Jersey, Texas, they frown on lease option arrangements. So you need to make sure where you're investing for that. If you got a question today, we really need you to come up to the mic if you could.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the benefits of the...
Right up to the mic. We need you to start today. This is Vegas, Roger. You know what I mean? It's not on? Is it off? Yeah. Is that green light on?
How's that?
There you go. Great. And you know what? Let's do this, Roger. Check it out. Do-do-do-do. There you go. All right.
I'm still struggling with the benefits of the renter, the lease option. If you're renting anyway, what's the... You've got an agreed upon term, why not just make an offer after you feel like qualified to buy the house?
Roger, a lot of situations today in the States is that the renters today that are renting houses are not necessarily qualified because of credit issues. So they can use that time period over the next 2 years or 3 years to build their credit back up on the side, get through a bankruptcy perhaps, or have a distant foreclosure, get even more distant, and they can make an arrangement for you, the owner of the house, while they're renting it, to buy that house at a later date at an agreed upon price, and maybe you might make an arrangement for a higher rent, a higher monthly payment, that a little bit of that payment will go towards down payment. Sometimes there's a lease option fee in place, non-refundable, that you take also with that. It depends on the deal.
So the agreed upon price, when do you agree upon it? Before?
You agree upon it before the lease option contract is put into place, correct.
Yeah.
It's what?
It's a
It's a gamble? What do you mean it's a gamble?
Well, you're agreeing upon the price before you know what the actual, let's say, appraisal price will be.
Correct, correct. You're going to put some thought into that here in the Las Vegas market because of the demand, because of the supply, even though we may be getting more supply. You know, this $70,000 house that we're buying, we feel in 2 years is going to be worth 105, that type of thing. Yes, there is a little bit of a risk with that, correct.
So that never happens at the end of the lease option where you agree on the price?
Lease options, you want to have the price outlined prior to the agreement, correct. Or that rarely happens at the lease, at the end of that lease. Good questions though. Option consideration. In contract law, typically, you're going to need consideration of a contract. There's got to be some kind of monetary transaction that takes place that makes that contract valid. It's one of the rules of contract law. So when you're putting an option agreement in place, there should be consideration with that option. An option, and we don't have this on there, but the option gives the person that owns the option the right, not the obligation, by the way, but the right to buy that property at a future date at a future agreed upon price. But for that option, that person is going to pay the owner, the current owner, an option fee, and that option fee is the option consideration. Now, there's an option premium. That's a two-sided definition. You might be able to pay that option over time. Also, there is a premium, meaning that if you've got other stipulations in that option agreement, you may actually have that person buying that option pay more for that. You know, like if the property goes down in value, that agreed upon price is adjusted at that point. You might want to pay a premium for that. The promissory note. A promissory note is an agreed upon payment over time at an interest rate during a certain term. And that promissory note typically goes with some type of lien, a mortgage typically on a property. The mortgage gives the right to the lender for them to take back that property if you are not adhering to the promissory note, okay? Seller financing. We're going to talk about this in detail. Seller financing is when the seller acts as the lender in the transaction. Maybe not for the whole thing, but a part or partial dollar amount for that transaction. So we're going to be talking about seller financing in detail and what we need to put in place for that. Subject to. This is what I'm really going to focus on tomorrow in detail, most of the day. Subject to is a situation where you're buying the property and you're taking the property, the ownership of it, but you're not taking the obligation of debt. You're actually leaving that in place. So you're taking the property subject to the mortgage that's already in place. I want you to think about this strategy very carefully because I think it's optimal for this period of time in this market to utilize this. Single-family houses, as long as you're fishing upstream, and apartment buildings. Great strategy to know. The title and the deed. We want to be cognizant in all of these strategies that you're going to learn this afternoon and tomorrow about the title work that needs to be done. Who owns the property? How does transfer of ownership happen? By way of what document? For instance, the quitclaim deed. Okay, so we're going to be going through that in detail. And the deed itself. The deed is going to show ownership of the property primarily. So I want you to get familiar with those two scenarios. The deed and any title work that would take place. So that's where... You want me to lower that?
No, it's okay. When you talk about subject to, you're taking on somebody else's mortgage, what's the bank looking for from you?
When you're taking it subject to nothing, you're not assuming the mortgage, you're taking it subject to the terms that are already in place. So you're leaving that mortgage in place and you're just dealing with the seller on transfer of ownership.
Oh, and that's okay with the bank?
We're going to be talking about all of that tomorrow. Absolutely. Absolutely.